Okay, guys, I welcome you to another session on Indian economy too. Now, today, what we are going to discuss is this is a reading on agricultural performance, which dates from independence, perhaps from 1950s onwards till 2013, and how how was the growth rate in this entire period. So essentially they have divided this entire period into four zones. So one is the pre green revolution phase, then you have the early phase of green revolution, then the maturing phase of green revolution, and the last phase that they're talking about is from 1992 till 2013. So broadly they are divided the entire timeline of agrarian economic growth into these four phases, and then they have further analyzed the growth rates in each of these phases and the food price inflation in all these phases, and they've come to a conclusion that the inflation in the post liberalization era is perhaps more muted as compared to the pre liberalization era. See, the 1991 reforms happens to be a watershed year or a watershed moment for the entire economy. So when we compare the post 1991 the growth rate, we see that the growth rate per se is not as huge as we have got in the maturing phase of green revolution. We'll see what the timeline is of that maturing phase of green revolution. But while the growth rate has not been that great, at the same point of time, due to certain factors which we are going to discuss, the inflation was not that high. The incidences of inflation was not as high as it was in the pre-liberalization era. And they give out 7-8 reasons for that. So this is the broad framework of this particular reading. Let's discuss this one by one. As I told you that in the post-liberalization era, despite the slowdown in agricultural growth rate and increasing cost of food production, we've talked about the increasing cost of food production in the previous two readings as well. I told you there's something called C2 costs, and because of the higher input pricing plus higher MSP, the cost of production was becoming higher. So despite the fact that there was an agriculture slowdown and the input costs were increasing, the post-economic reform period, which is what is given in from 1992 to 2013 in this reading, we see that the inflation, the food prices increase were muted as compared to the initial phase of green revolution, which is 1967 to 1980, and the maturing phase, which is 1980 to 1990. Then the reasons given post 1991 for the muted inflation as compared to the previous phases is that we have had a higher buffer stock, the public distribution system was better, and we had trade liberalization because of which import was easier. Then we had higher foreign exchange. So there are 7 reasons for this which are given in this reading. We'll go to them one by one. This is what I've already talked about. As I've told you that in this reading, the growth part of agriculture is divided into 4 phases. The phases are pre-green revolution, which is phase 1, 1950 to 1964, which perhaps coincides with the Nehruvian phase as well. The initial phase of green revolution from 1967 to 1980, the mature phase from 1980 to 1991, and the post reform phase, economic reforms, which is from 1992 to 2013 till date. The reading till the date the reading is was printed. So this is a reading of 2015. So the data given is still 2013. Now, another thing that you need to note is the performance of agriculture in these 4 phases. Now, what was the performance in the first phase from 1950 to 1964? Was the phase where we had acute shortages of food grains. And why was this acute shortage? Because a lot of the most fertile agrarian land, which was the Indus system, a lot of that land went to the Pakistan side. So because of that, the output perhaps was lower than expected. Apart from the fact that to fulfill our domestic requirements, we had to resort to a lot of imports, and there were large scale imports being done from US, which was under a program called PL 480. This was the program. ultimately, because we were not a food sovereign nation, and US in the era of Cold War. Remember, this is the era of emergence of Cold War between US and USSR. In this era, US was kind of armed to a state or foreign policy, using PL 480 as the ransom. So that's why we realized in the early 60s that we cannot be left to the mercy of the Cold War countries for our food supplies. Therefore, the program of the initiation of the program actually started in the early 60s. And in the initial phase also, there were other programs that we had done, which were large scale investments in agricultural infrastructure. Land reforms as a subject was taken up, and rural schemes were there. So these were certain schemes which were taken up by the Nehruvian government. Then coming to the next phase is the initial starting phase of the Green Revolution. Now, in this phase, the Green Revolution was limited to a very small area, not absolutely small, but relatively small as compared to the country. So, what was this area? This area was primarily Punjab, Haryana, and Western UP. So, why this area was selected? This area was selected because the agricultural land was huge here, and to utilize the benefits of Green Revolution, which was to utilize the HYV seeds, high yielding variety seeds, you needed huge tracts of land, because this technology was more beneficial with economies of scale. So larger the land, the more beneficial will be the implementation of technology. And it started with that of wheat. So in the initial phase, you see from 1967 till 1980, whatever growth rate that happened was only in terms of the improvement in yield performance of wheat, rather than the whole agricultural sector as a whole. And that is visible here. See, the period between 1967 till 1980, the agrarian growth rate actually decreased as compared to the previous phase. And it then suddenly increased to 3.09%, 3.1%, and then again decreased to 2.09. What we are going to argue is that despite the fall in growth rate as compared to the maturing phase of this phase 3, as compared to that, we have seen a decline in growth rate, but still, when we compare the food inflation as compared to these periods, we will see that the food inflation is much lower in the post-economic reforms phase as compared to the pre-economic reforms. So this is what is mentioned here. Now, after this, we come to the post-economic reform phase, which is phase 4. And we see that we have already studied about this in the previous reading, that there was no explicit policy towards agrarian reforms. Whatever reforms were there were perhaps reforms by stealth, or they were collateral reforms in the form of opening up of the economy. So that increasing relative prices. Remember the previous reading, the terms of trade increased for agriculture, the relative prices increased for agriculture, and there were incidental benefits because of the fact that there were liberalization of industries, and the fact that the exchange rate was overvalued earlier, and which was now market driven, and the fact that now the market you could export and import food grains from India. So these were ancillary benefits which the agrarian sector got because of the reforms that happened in the manufacturing sector, on the industrial sector. There were no direct reforms. If we talk about the growth rate of output and the yield, both for majority of commodities, we see a decline in this period, and that you can also see in table 2. Now, in table 2, you can perhaps see in the period in the second phase between 1967 till 1980. Can you see a decline in yield as compared to the previous period, and the decline in growth rate as well? Whereas in the next phase, which is the maturing phase, you have an increasing yield as well as an increasing out. And when we talk about the current phase, which is according to the reading, we see again a decline in the yield and a decline in the out. Apart from that, if you see, what I was talking about is that in the 1960 to 1980 period, there was only one commodity which benefited out of the for initial phase of Green Revolution, which was, apart from that, all other sectors were on a decline. Whereas if you see the maturing phase, you will find that almost all sectors were doing well. So this is what we are talking about, that in the post-liberalization era, the output as well as the yield has actually decreased. But at the same point of time, we'll talk about the fact that the inflation is much lower. Now, coming to the trends in food inflation. Now, the trends in food inflation is measured through two components of WPI. Now, what are these two components? These two components are A, primary food articles, which is basically the food articles that go into the WPI, and the manufactured food items, basically, which is, for example, the primary food article can be mango, but a manufactured food product can be mango pickle. So we divide these food articles into two groups. One is the primary food articles, and the other is manufacturing food products, which is kind of processing these food. And most of these studies actually indicate that the threshold level of inflation in the agrarian sector is 6%. So anything above 6% inflation in the agrarian sector will be called as a high inflation phase. So this is the benchmark which has been decided by a number of studies. So this, on the basis of these parameters, we will be judging the trends in food. Let's analyze that how have prices responded to in each of these periods. If we go by the pre-green revolution period, we see that the food article price inflation was higher at four instances. So this is the pre-green revolution phase, and you can find out that this, and this. These are the four instances where the food inflation was quite high. And if you see the average, inflation recorded in this episodes, it ranged from 8.5% to 15%. All of this is also recorded in table 3. If you see this is the period that we are talking about, and these are the four phases of high inflation, and the range is from 8.5% to 15%. Now, you don't need to remember typical data. There's a lot of data to remember, but you can't remember all of that data. So what you can remember is that the inflation rate was high in this period. Whereas if you talk about the green revolution, the initial phase of green revolution, remember the initial phase is from 67 till 80. From 67 till 80, if we see the initial phase of green revolution, we can see that there were three episodes of high inflation. Now, where are these three episodes of high inflation? One is mentioned here, the other is mentioned here, and the third one is mentioned here. So these are the three phases of in the initial phase of green revolution. You find these three phases, and the average peak in this period was between 20% to 10%. That means there was tremendous amount of inflation in this early period. Perhaps because of the fact that there was no yield improvement, except for that. Apart from that, there were other reasons as well in this period. You had two wars in this period, and then you had the OPEC crisis in this period. So there were other factors because of which the prices had increased. Then we talk about the maturing phase of green revolution, and in this period there were again three occasions of higher inflation, and the inflation ranged from 10% to 15%. So if you see this, then you can see 1, 2, and 3 phases of higher inflation, and in these the range is again from 10% to 15%. Whereas after economic reform, we see 4 phases of high inflation in the country, and the inflation ranges from 9% to 12%. So this is what we are trying to see, that the range of high inflation is just 9 to 13 in the last phase, whereas in all other phases, for example, from in the maturing phase, it's from 10 to 15%, if you can remember this figure, and from the initial phase, it's from 10% or 11% to 20%. All of this comparison, if you can remember, this comparison shows us that while the growth rate per se was lower in the post-economic reform phase, when we compare it to the inflation, the episodes of inflation and the kind of intensity of inflation that we see in food commodities is much lower than the previous two phases. And we find a similar experience when we talk about the manufactured food articles. It's a similar kind of a trend. And the 4 phases that I was going to talk about is 1, 2, 3. These are perhaps the 4 phases. let's see. This we have already argued that that despite the decline in agricultural GDP and the food output, the post economic reforms period saw a lower food inflation as compared to the initial two phases. In this part, in the next part of the reading, which is perhaps the most important, we argue what are the reasons for perhaps a lower food inflation in the post-economic reforms era as compared to the previous two eras. Especially, we want to know that why the post-economic reforms era had lower inflation versus maturing phase, because maturing phase saw a huge expansion in entire across spectrum. We see that there was a huge expansion in yield as well as output. So why is it the fact that on one hand you are saying that the economic growth in agriculture is high here, but and the output produces higher here, but at the same point the inflation is lower here. In fact, the inflation is the highest in this period. So so why is this not matching up? So we will go into these 7 reasons for that. The first reason is that this is the first reason that while the food production in the post economic era was the overall output was less, but at the same point of time the production was very consistent. What do we mean by consistent? There were less troughs and peaks. So in a sense, when we analyze the data, we can analyze this with a standard deviation. That the standard deviation or the variance, basically, if you talk about the variance of production was much lower in the post-liberalization era as compared to the pre-liberalization era. So in the post-liberalization era, the output was lower but more stable. There were no major peaks or troughs. So, and we compare this through what is the standard deviation, and this is given in table 7. See table 7, standard deviation. And if we see here, see the standard deviation was extremely high in food grains in the initial phase, and then it decreased in the next phase, but in this phase the standard deviation was the least. That means basically, which means the variance was less. That means the change in output, the roughs and the troughs, the troughs and the peaks was much lower, much condensed as compared to the previous two peaks. So lower fluctuations will cause fewer disruption in the supply. If there are low fluctuations, if there are high fluctuations, then the disruption in the food supply will be more. And if there are lower fluctuations, then the disruptions will be low. And if the disruptions in the food supply will be low, then it will lead to lower food inflation. So that is the first logic behind lower food inflation in the post-economic reform period, despite a lower growth rate as compared to the previous. The second explanation is the shift in food consumption. This is an argument which we have already covered in the previous reading. And this argument talks about the fact that in the maturing phase of the Green Revolution, which is from if we see from 1983 to 1994. So this is the NSSO conducts the household consumption expenditure survey, and on this survey we see that there has been a secular shift. There has been a consistent shift of the consumption pattern of people in India from the normal cereals towards the shift towards high food items, high protein items. This we have also talked about in the first reading in agriculture, the conundrum part, that why people have started consuming less of cereals and they are moving towards high protein items. So, and one of the reasons is, and if we see what are the trends? The trends is the drop in the expenditure share in cereals in both rural and urban areas. The second trend that we see is that the high value food commodities, the share has increased both in urban and rural areas. And 3, the highest percentage increase is in the pulses, milk, sugar, edible oil, vegetables, fruits. So these are all expensive items. So all of this shift shows that there has been a protein shift towards protein items. And why has this shift been? This shift has been because of the fact that the diets have changed in the country. And why have the diets changed? Because of the fact that real agricultural wages in the 80s actually increased because of higher income, because of the fact that this was the phase of maturing green revolution, and the green revolution also extended to areas of eastern UP, Bihar, Odisha, the southern states. So because of that, all farmers across India were able to benefit out of green revolution, and not just wheat. But now the expansion was more in terms of rice. Apart from the fact there was initiation of milk revolution, and then yellow revolution. So all of that ultimately led to higher incomes in the hands of the farmers, and with higher incomes, their demand for high value food actually. So that perhaps had led to what is called, we've also talked about this, as protein inflation. The third reason, which we have also talked about previously, is the role of minimum support price. Now now there has been a lot of arguments regarding this. The first reading talked about the fact that it's because of the increasing MSP that there was incidences of higher inflation, where the second reading talks about the fact that because of the cost of production has actually increased, that necessitated, and the fact that the global prices were also increasing, that necessitated the increasing MSP. So we will try to understand that how and why the increase in MSP actually could have contributed to lower inflation, which is very counterintuitive. So the first factor is that the what will happen is that the procurement of food grains by the government at higher MSP can cause food inflation. If the government MSP increases, automatically it can lead to a higher food inflation. How can it lead to higher food inflation? Because if the government assures the market that this will be the minimum price, this will be the floor price, that sets the ball rolling for a higher price inflation in those commodities. That means that this will be the lowermost prices, but the market price can be at least the floor price, which is the MSP, or can be even higher than. So that is why higher MSP sets the ball rolling towards a higher inflation path due to the expectation that builds in. Higher benchmark for market prices feeding into the food price expectations. Then the second is that once that the fact that prices of food grains supplied in the government also increases, it also increases the kind of prices at which the public distribution system will be able to provide, and the open market sales scheme. Now let me explain you this part, because this is a little technical part. Now, as I told you that MSP will be the floor price. This will be the price at which the government will be ready to buy whatever food grains that the farmer will be willing to sell. But what about procurement price? Now, procurement price is the price at which actually the government buys from the farmers. Now, if this is the MSP, which is the lowest price, the procurement price will at least be equal to MSP, or can be more than MSP. Now, how can the procurement price be more than MSP? It can be more if suppose the government promises to pay a farmer 1,000 rupees a quintal for rice, but this promise was made at the point of sowing of the rice, basically the starting of the Kharif period. So this is the perhaps the time when the CACP will start announcing the MSP for the commodities in the Kharif season. Now suppose it announces the price of 1,000 rupees, but at the end of sowing, and when the farmer was about to bring the commodity to the market, we realized that there is a shortage in the market. There is a huge demand for rice, and because of a higher demand for rice, the actual price of rice in the market is somewhere around 1,200. So the government of the day needs to procure rice for the PDS purposes, and it also needs to procure the rice for open market sales. In future, if it wants to tame down the inflation, this is how it will tame down the inflation. So that means the procurement price, if the MSP is higher, then the procurement price will be at least equal to MSP, or will be higher than. So the procurement price being higher, then the MSP will again lead to the inflationary expectations and inflation in the economy. Then the third is that if the MSP is very high, then the farmer has an option that, okay, I don't want to go to the market to sell my produce. What I will do is, the government is willing to buy whatever I'm willing to sell at this particular floor rate. So the farmer will be ready to sell whatever he has produced to the government at this point. And if the government of the day is buying all that produce through FCI, what will happen? It will essentially crowd out the private market, because if the government procures everything and not enough is left for the private market, then what will happen? In the private market, the inflation will be there. It edges out, basically it crowds out the private trade in the market, because of the quantum of food grain which is being taken by the FCI. So because of these three reasons, a higher MSP can lead to a higher food inflation. However, what we find is that while the MSP has been increasing, we find lower average inflation in the post economic reforms era as compared to the maturing phase, and the explanation is counterintuitive. You can see the inflation, you can see the minimum support price. If you see the minimum support price, there's a huge kind of point on inflection here, and it takes a zoom here. But if you see, it's actually after 93, 94 that the MSP starts for a secular increase. This is the first kind of a phase, and then it kind of peaks again. So A is this phase, and then you see the MSP and the inflation and the inflation rate of the wheat. Higher MSP, you see higher inflation. You see higher MSP, you see higher inflation. Both of them are related to each other, but at the same point of time, we are saying that the inflation rate was much lower in the post reform period on an average as compared to the pre-reform period. Now let's understand how is that. As I've already told you that the MSP was substantially higher. However, if you break down this post-economic reform period, the post-economic reform period can further be divided into two phases. One of the phases is the annual increase in inflation of MSP between 2001 till 2005, and for wheat from 2002 to 2006. So for a very long period, the increase in MSP was actually quite low, and this has been circled. So if you can see this period, this is the period that we are talking about, that the inflation is very low because of the fact that MSP increase in this period was very low, and this is also given in this period. So essentially between 2001 till 2006, you don't see a higher food inflation because of the fact that the MSP were low. Both before this period and after this period, you see an explosion of MSP for both the commodities. If you see before this period and after this period, so apart from this period, you see across both the regions, you see a higher inflation. And in fact, if you see the overall inflation in this period is quite high as compared to if you average out this period. Let's understand this more. So both prior to and after these periods of the post-economic reform period, this particular period of 2001 till 2006, you see the annual increase in MSPs was quite high. And the other reasons why the MSP why there was a modest increase in MSP and why the food prices were actually low in this period is that the reason for low rice and low wheat inflation between this period appears to be because of the fact that the central issue price was actually free. Now let us understand what is this central issue price. The FCI buys the commodity, the food from the farmers at the procurement price, which can be equal to MSP or can be greater than the MSP. This is the price at which per quintal the FCI will buy. But over and above that, this is just the cost of the grains. But then the FCI will have to move this commodity. It will involve trucks, logistics, and then warehousing all of that commodity. That means you have to add the procurement incidentals, which is the cost of procurement, basically all of the logistic cost. So what the cost to central government is what is the cost, which is the procurement price plus the procurement incident. But at the same point of time, the central government now releases this whatever it has procured to different state government on the basis of the fact that how many BPL families are there in each particular, how much poverty is there in each particular state. So on the basis of that, this food grain which is now been accumulated is now then distributed, and the rate at which the central government issues this food grain, per kg food grain, per quintal food grain, to the state government is called as the central issue price. And what we see after 2002 till today, from 2002 the central issue price has not changed. That means it is the same rate at which in 2002 the central government was issuing wheat and rice to the state government. It's the same rate today in 2020. So this central issue price has not changed, whereas the procurement price of course has been increasing year after year, plus the procurement incidental because of the increase fuel prices, warehousing cost prices, the procurement price, the procurement incidentals, the cost of the cost to the government has been increasing. So the difference between the procurement cost minus the central issue price, which is the what is the central government receiving out of selling, is the food subsidy. And if you see this food subsidy, this has actually exploded after 2002. See the food subsidy, and you can find the year 2001, 2002, and actually 2002 is the year when it actually explodes. And since then, can you see that there has been a huge increase in the prices in the food subsidy. This is because of the expansion between the procurement price plus procurement incidentals minus the CI. This is what gives you the food. I hope you understand this concept. Because of this, the government subsidy actually started increasing, but that subsidy was basically because the government was giving the subsidy. That subsidy actually protected the inflation to rise. So because the government was selling the food grains at a very cheaper cost, the state governments could pass on the food grains at a cheaper cost to the people of the states. So that is why, and that is the reason why the food inflation between 2001 till 2006 was muted. The food inflation was muted. Moving forward, as regards to the other phase, the next phase is from 2007 till 2012. As I've already told you that because of the fact that between 2002 to 2006, between this period, the food stock grain and the fact that the buffer stock was low, B, that the global prices were high, and this fact that the cost of production was increasing. So I'm more reading and I'm giving you the summary. After 2007, all these three factors were working, and because of which the MSP had to increase at a substantial pace, and that perhaps also led to a higher inflation in the market. So that higher inflation that we see is kind of the fact that the supply side was not working. Then, apart from the fact that in this period the government from 2007 till 2012, remember the previous reading, the government was buying substantial amount of food. The availability to the public was not that huge, but at the same point of time, the FCI was procuring huge amounts of food. Remember, by 2013, what had happened? The buffer stock should be somewhere around 32 million tons, but it was actually 82 million tons. So the government was procuring huge amounts of food and was not allowing exports as well in this period. It was an export ban on wheat and rice, and that is why not sufficient amount of food was being released, or the fact that the private sector trade was being crowded out because government became the major buyer. So because of all these factors, there was a higher food inflation in this period. But still, if we compare it to the other periods, you'll perhaps find that the inflation was much lower as compared to the maturing phase. The fourth reason is the role of buffer stock. Now, what happens is that if you have higher buffer stocks with you, then your ability to dampen the prices in the market increases. It's something like a saving. If there is a sort of crisis, then you can always bank on your savings to calm things down. So this buffer stock is kind of a saving that you have. If you have sufficient amount of buffer stocks, which we have seen that we have built up after 2005, 2006, because of the fact that we have higher buffer stocks, the incident of inflation is much lower as compared to this period. In this period, you have higher food inflation because of the fact that the government did not have higher buffer stock. So the government actually did not have the ability to come to the open market and actually operate something like open market operations. So that ability to check the speculative tendencies and send a signal to the market that I have sufficient amount of food stock. If there is any speculative tendency in the market, artificially if the price is increasing, then I will intervene inside the market and reduce that particular price, which perhaps has been done at a very efficient level by the NDA government. The moment the NDA government came to power, because of the kind of open market operation that it did, the food inflation was quite tamed down after 2004. So this is because of higher buffer stocks in the post economic reform period that you had lower inflation. Then the fifth reason is that post liberalization you have import liberalization, and with import liberalization what happens is that if there is any inflation in any particular commodity, what you can always do is import that particular commodity. And we have seen that after opening up of the economy, several agricultural products like pulses, oil seeds, vegetables, fruits, all of this can be significantly can be imported if there is any instance of higher food inflation in the domestic market. So if there is higher inflation, what the government can do, government can easily allow imports, and with the imports coming, it can dampen the inflation in the market. So opening up of the economy has also helped in the post-economic reform period to reduce the amount of food inflation, which was not perhaps possible in the pre-economic reform period when there were constraints over availability or the policy or the policy factors, policy instruments through which you can tame down the food inflation. And one of the major factors is that you have decanalized the imports of food items. By decanalization, we mean that the private sector can easily go and import the food product, which is called decanalization. The sixth reason is the cost of production. The cost of production is extremely important in terms of inflation. We see a higher cost of inflation. Of course, we see a higher cost of inflation in the post-economic reform period because of higher diesel prices and other factors. However, if we see the real wages increase, as I told you, the real wages increase actually happened in the 80s because of higher income. So when we compare our post-economic reform period real wages, when we compare it to the maturing phase, we find out the real wages were growing at a lower pace as compared to the 80s. And because in the 80s, the real wages were increasing at a very high cost. That's why the cost of production was increasing, and because the cost of production was increasing, the MSP had to be higher. Across led to a higher food inflation in the 80s rather than in the post-economic reform. So what's the summary? The summary is actually all these points that we have already mentioned, all these 6 points that we had discussed. All these 6 points that we have discussed is given in these 6 points here. And what are the policy implications? The policy implication is that in the long run, we want to have a liberal trade policy, and we also want to focus on the stability of growth rate, so that once the yield increases, we can always tame down the inflation. And the other factor is that we can have a better buffer stock management policy through which we can stabilize the price. So this has been our overall discussion on this particular reading. However, I still feel that the second reading of this unit is the most important reading, and you should not leave that. But still, given this is a very small reading, you can easily cover this. So with this, I would like to wrap up this particular class. If you have any questions, you can always post me on WhatsApp. Thank you guys. Bye-bye.